Okay, three, two, and one. All right, welcome to part one of Motion Pictures, chapter 7. In fact, I think the textbook, let's see, I should memorize this by now after all the times I've taught it, but chapter 7, by the way, just so you guys know, so we're on the same page, is movies and the impact of images. And this is going to be split into three parts, which I'm very excited about. Part one, obviously, is going to be some of the modern doings of motion pictures. We're going to go through some of the what is considered the most impactful movies in film history, and talk about sort of the financial impact that Hollywood has, not just on the world, internationally, but here domestically in the United States, and of course here in Santa Clarita. Very important. Part two, we start our history. And I kind of split film history up into two parts. So in total, there will be three parts of this lecture. So let's begin with part one, because I think you'll find this very, very interesting. All right, and I encourage you to watch this all the way through, because there's going to be material that I talk about that will be on a quiz or a final exam. And quite honestly, I think you'll just find it interesting in itself. All right, so we can't begin without talking about recent headlines, right? Some now COVID-19 related, some not, right? It's an interesting it's been an interesting chapter for the film industry over the better part of the past 2 years because of COVID. But basically, before we get to that, let's talk about obviously you're watching this in the spring, and you should be watching this, I'm guessing, in early April. So basically or mid-April, I guess, is when you're technically watching this. So about 3 or 4 weeks ago, depending on when you're watching this, we of course had the Academy Awards. Of course, one of the more interesting aspects of the Academy Awards, I think, when people think of the Oscars from 2022, they won't be thinking about a lot of the awards that were given out or, who won Best Picture. Right. I think it will always, forever be about Will Smith going on stage and slapping Chris Rock. So it's obviously been a few weeks since that happened. I'm sure there's been numerous news stories out there. But what's interesting is that the Oscar ratings, because of that moment, at least that's my firm belief, climbed 58% from last year. But it's still the second lowest viewership in history. So I know that award shows in general on television have been struggling mightily to connect with the public. This is one of those conversations that I wish we could have in real time, because I'd love to find out why you guys didn't watch the Oscars. But I can almost guarantee you, who's ever watching this and who's ever attending this class can probably tell me that the majority of you didn't watch the Oscars this year. But when you heard about the Will Smith Chris Rock incident on stage, which was of course all over social media, and there was a lot of folks that actually tuned in following that moment, and then of course I think you could say that there was probably a larger audience about 30 minutes or 35 minutes later when Will Smith accepted his award for Best Actor. So anyway, that's the Oscar update. Amazon just closed an $8.5 billion deal on MGM. That's of course a major studio, and it's most, I guess you could say the James Bond franchise is part of MGM. Amazon closed that deal though to have access to 4,000 films and 17,000 television shows. If you're not familiar with MGM, you might be familiar with Handmaid's Tale or Fargo. Those are a couple of series. Anyway, the reason Amazon's doing this is because essentially Amazon wants more content for its streaming platform. And so, you are seeing sort of an arms race, if you will, with movie studios and streaming, or I should say streaming platforms and movie studios, and getting access to their treasure trove of content. So anyway, productions are eyeing a move away from Eastern Europe locations. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has dominated the headlines this spring, certainly that's having a profound effect because Hollywood has done a lot of location shooting and soundstage shooting in Europe. In many ways, it's obviously European film, but in other ways, it's also because traditionally filming overseas has been cheaper than filming here at home, depending on the location. Well, that is clearly having an effect. I should say Russia's invasion of Ukraine is certainly having production companies basically, shift their focus away from Eastern Europe, which of course they're worried for obviously crew safety and the geopolitical nature of things. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. COVID now has continually, I think, backed up what we were expecting to see in theaters. I know in teaching this class in the last 2 years, there's been a number of movies that have been shifted around because, as you know, when COVID first hit in March of 20, theaters were closed for quite some time, not just here in the US, but internationally. And then there's been kind of a sporadic sort of return, if you will, to viewing in theaters, right? Well, if you're a major movie company and you were trying to maximize as much money as possible toward a release, there was definitely a lot of what I call big ticket films that were supposed to be released at certain times. They'd already been shot, or maybe they were even delayed in being shot because, Hollywood, like everything else, shut down for several months. And then in its return, it's been kind of a patchwork to get it back in. So anyway, Warner Brothers shifts release dates of Aquaman 2 and The Flash into 2023. I think another one that certainly is one you can look at right now is Top Gun. I know that there's been some excitement over the Top Gun remake, if you will, from the 80s. Now we have one in supposedly it's going to be out this spring. That's the word, but that's something that's been on the that's been delayed several times, and a lot of it has to do with COVID. And then finally, I guess I should have put this under the Ukraine war. It would have made more sense, right? But anyway, Netflix suspends service in Russia following the pause of theatrical distribution by studios and festival bans. Really, Russia, I think financially, a lot of companies, including Hollywood, trying to put the squeeze on Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine. And, you see a lot of corporations not doing business in Russia right now, and it's no different with Hollywood and of course Netflix. So those are your recent headlines. There's of course plenty more where that came from, but those are like 5 or 6 that I pulled out, sort of, that I thought you might appreciate. Anyway, so let's get on to our top films, because I think when you think of Hollywood, right, you think of what has Hollywood produced, right? And I want to talk a lot about the impact of Hollywood in this part one of this lecture, because not only are we going to talk about what Hollywood means financially, but also what Hollywood means culturally. And so it's interesting that there's a organization called the American Film Institute, or AFI. And basically several years ago, and they've done it a couple different times now, they wanted to basically enlist a panel of experts, if you will, people from all over the industry, to basically vote on what they thought were the top films ever made. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they're the most expensive films ever made, or the film that made the most money at the box office, but simply what films culturally and from an impact standpoint, absolutely are kind of at the top of the pyramid. And so I'm going to actually share these. You have links to clips of these movies that are on these PowerPoints, but you're welcome to do your own research if you want, and look at some of these films, or at least excerpts of some of these films, because they're all over Google, of course. I'm sorry, all over YouTube. Anyway, Citizen Kane is considered by AFI the top film ever made. And if you remember when we were talking about the radio industry, and we talked about the fact that in 1938, Orson Welles, did the War of the Worlds, right? Well, Orson Welles, of course, is also a very famous Hollywood director. And in 1942, he created and directed the classic Citizen Kane, which was a fictional tale, by the way, of William Randolph Hearst, who we will learn about, by the way, when we get to journalism. He's a very significant person in journalism history. William Randolph Hearst was, someone that was all about, just to give you a little tease, he started out here on the West Coast. He ran a number of newspapers on the East Coast in New York City, and really was all about sensationalism. And, you could say that William Randolph Hearst would have absolutely thrived in 2022 based on his philosophy. But anyway, the fictional, I don't know, I just created a word there. The fictional William Randolph Hearst was a guy named Charles Foster Kane. And so Orson Welles did this film about the rise and fall of Charles Foster Kane, Citizen Kane, right? And what's interesting is that when the movie originally came out, it was on its face not as popular, or I think seen as impactful as it later would be seen. So not to say that it didn't get a lot of critical acclaim, because it did, but it just wasn't, it was one of those films that kind of grew on people as you started to, take a further distance from it and assess it. But at the time, it garnered 9 Academy Award nominations, but only 1 award, which was for Best Original Screenplay. But the reason it is so, I think it's considered such a gold standard for Hollywood and just for film in general, is it's particularly praised for its cinematography. Orson Welles, very much an innovator when it came to cinematography rather, and deep focus shots. It used camera tricks and placement, music and narrative structure, which had been considered innovative and precedent setting. So it had all of these things sort of that sort of combined to make this film just an absolute, visual and narrative, delight. Anyway, but Welles was given complete control of the film, by the way. And during the production of Citizen Kane, a little known fact here is that Welles consumed 30 cups of coffee per day, which led to caffeine poisoning. Don't know if you knew that. And I think there's so many facts about this film, but William Randolph Hearst actually tried to keep it out of theaters. He was unsuccessful, but it obviously struck a nerve with the real William Randolph Hearst, and he actually tried to keep it out of theaters unsuccessfully, of course. All right, number 2 on AFI's list, and by the way, please do yourself a favor and click on that link. Second one is Godfather. Okay, 1972. I think a lot of you have probably heard of The Godfather, but it starred Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, Robert Duvall, James Caan. It was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. And interestingly enough, I would say Godfather and Godfather 2, the sequel, were both given Best Picture. So it's really got a significant role in film history. A lot of people, I think, assume that Godfather was kind of the first major mob film ever made, if you will, but it really wasn't. But you can definitely say that a movie like Goodfellas, for example, or a series like Sopranos can really owe its existence to the fact that Godfather was one of those films that really really kind of plowed the road. But actually, Little Caesar in the 1930s was considered the first mob movie, just so you know. It was not Godfather. But anyway, it won 3 Academy Awards, the original film Godfather, including Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It had a famous quote, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse." And the story itself, by the way, spanned from 1945 to 55. It chronicles the family under the patriarch Vito Corleone, focusing on the transformation of Michael Corleone from elected family outsider to ruthless mafia boss. And for a time, it was the highest grossing film ever made. Some other fun facts about this movie: Marlon Brando used cue cards Mob and mafia were never actually uttered in the film, and Brando turned down his best actor over treatment of American Indians by the film industry. So it had some political activism tied to it on the award show. So click on that link. You'll learn some more interesting facts about The Godfather, but certainly you see this movie pop up on AMC on cable a couple times a year, and you really kind of have to really take hats off to Francis Ford Coppola, for that movie. It's definitely a classic. Number 3 is actually kind of different. Casablanca, made around the same time as Citizen Kane. Whoops, let me get it in the middle here. Okay. It was made in 1942. Humphrey Bogart there on the left, Ingrid Bergman on the right. It was based during World War II, set in the Moroccan city of Casablanca. It focuses on an American expatriate who must choose between his love for a woman and helping her Czech resistance leader husband escape the Vichy-controlled city of Casablanca to continue his fight against the Nazis. So it was basically set in World War II. It won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, one of the most famous lines in movie history. Here's looking at you, kid. It's interesting also in the fact that if you watch the film, Humphrey Bogart actually in this picture looks taller than Ingrid Bergman, but in effect, she was actually taller than him, and they had to use apple boxes, camera placement, etc. It's also, if you look at old black and white films, if you look at Ingrid Bergman, every time they took a close-up of her, like I'm on a close-up now, they softened her features, they hardened his features, and so really kind of a cool film. All right, one that's a little bit more modern, I guess you could say, just a smidge. Number 4 is Raging Bull. That was made in 1980. You're looking at Robert De Niro right there. He played boxer Jake LaMotta. And if you don't know your movie history, basically this, whoa, going crazy here, guys. Sorry. This was actually directed by Martin Scorsese, one of my favorite directors of all time. He did more recently did The Irishman, which was like that 3.5 to 4 hour slog on Netflix. I actually liked it. I just thought it was long. And then, of course, one of my favorite movies he did of all time was The Departed with Leo DiCaprio and company. So anyway, back to Raging Bull, though. The thing that made Raging Bull so terrific is, first of all, it was, even though it was 1980, it was shot, Scorsese shot it in black and white to make it look like an old film. And by the way, if you don't know, essentially, Raging Bull was a real life tale of boxer Jake LaMotta, an Italian-American middleweight boxer whose self-destructive and obsessive rage, sexual jealousy, and animalistic appetite destroyed his relationship with wife and family. It is highly praised for editing. In fact, it won an Academy Award for Best Editing. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. What's interesting, and it has a tie-in to Citizen Kane, is it opened to mixed reviews, but only, I think, as time went on, it became apparent what a culturally significant movie this was. Not to mention from a technical standpoint, if you ever watch, if you ever want to watch an amazing example of good, clean, tight, ferocious editing, that's what Raging Bull brings to the table. And it also introduced the actor Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci was actually in this film before he obviously became famous for Lethal Weapon and Goodfellas, of course, and Casino, where he played two iconic roles in those films. Anyway, Actual Boxer, the movie, by the way, was inspired by, the film Raging Bull was inspired by the movie Rocky, which had won Best Picture in 1976. And Actual Boxer Jake LaMotta was on set for the fight scenes, which I think is pretty cool. And one last cool note about Joe Pesci, by the way, he was running an Italian restaurant at the time. So imagine that. So, all right. Number 5 is Singing in the Rain. Okay, that is actually a comedy and a musical. It's the only one of the top 5 that's in that category. It was made in 1952. Gene Kelly, on the post there, one of the most iconic scenes, please click on it, where he's singing the signature song. I guarantee you if I played this, as part of this lecture, we would get taken down like that, but you can play it separately on YouTube. But anyway, it's Gene Kelly, Donald O'Connor, and Debbie Reynolds. If you don't know who Debbie Reynolds is, she was the real life mother of Carrie Fisher of Star Wars fame, of which both Carrie and Debbie died within a couple days of each other. Very sad. That was a couple years ago. So anyway, why it's significant is it offered a comical version of Hollywood's transition from silent film to talkie, as they called it, talkies, right? We will talk about that in part 2, and it garnered 2 Academy Award nominations. Now, next up is the most popular film, right? And the reason it's not the most significant film, but the most popular film is how much money this would have made if adjusted for inflation. But it's Gone with the Wind, 1939, made in the same year as Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach. It starred Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable, with one of the most famous movie lines in history. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, right? It was a Southern epic, and it's had controversy as of late because, clearly there's been films made over time that have been made in the era they were made, where we've had a little bit different view of, or a little different philosophy when it comes to racial, what's the word I'm looking for here? Racial phrases and how we view race, how we view black and white, etc. And so for a short time, HBO actually took this down out of their library. There was a big pushback on that. And so now, Gone with the Wind is back on HBO Max, but it comes with a disclaimer, or at least a heads up that, this isn't maybe the same kind of film that you'd see made in 2022. In fact, you wouldn't see this type of film made in 2022, but it's a powerful movie that, adjusted for inflation, would have made $3.73 billion, and it was made in 1939. Avatar, by the way, is number 2, the James Cameron epic, right? James Cameron also did Titanic back in 1997. So between those 2 films alone, we're talking 6.5 billion adjusted for inflation. Star Wars, that's the original, right? Chapter 4, I think it's called A New Hope, if I'm, for my Star Wars geeks out there. When it first came out in 1977, that's a $3 billion film right there. And then Avengers Endgame, a more recent film released in 2019. I guess it had the advantage of being pre-pandemic, and it made 2.9 billion. So speaking of money, I want to run through some of the top films, and I want you to see the difference between what was box office, how much money was being earned at the box office by films by Hollywood before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and then post-pandemic. I think you'll find this fascinating. So 2019, the last full year that Hollywood had that did not have to deal with the pandemic, right? Because as you know, COVID-19 first popped up on the radar in a massive way here in February and certainly in March. You could say that it was around, I think a lot of people now sort of make the pretty astute assumption that it was in China as maybe as far back as fall of 2019. But certainly it wasn't affecting us here in any shape or form until 2020. So Avengers Endgame, now these are domestic numbers, meaning these are the amount of money that was earned here in the United States. And you can see there's a significant difference between what was earned in internationally and what was earned, what's called domestically. But still, $858 million was the top film. That was Avengers. You had The Lion King, Toy Story 4, Frozen 2, Captain Marvel, right? The top international film that same year, of course, was Endgame with 2.7 billion. Previous year, the top film, at least domestically, was Black Panther. So that should take you down a little like memory lane there. Look at the difference though. 2020, Remember, this is when Hollywood and everybody else kind of shut down. You couldn't go to a theater, and even if you did, it was very, very sporadic. Bad Boys for Life only made 204 million domestically, and I would guarantee you that most of that, all this, in fact, was made prior to March, mid-March of 2020. So Bad Boys for Life was 204 million. 1917, by the way, a phenomenal film. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's all shot in, pseudo one take. It's really fascinating. Anyway, so you can see, like, even Star Wars Episode 9, which, by the way, had been on had been in the theaters in the holiday season of 2019 and then carried over to 2020. You can see all of the incredible numbers and drop off in box office in 2020. Now look at 2022. That's the next. You could look at 2021 on your own, but in 2022, okay, here are the top 3 films as of, and this again, I'm recording this in actually April 1st. So these numbers will probably change a little bit between, and maybe the films will change a little bit between when I recorded this and when you actually watch it. But as of April 1st, top films in 2022, The Batman, 333 million here in the United States, 674 million internationally. Spider-Man No Way Home, 227 million, but it's actually earned, because this is a film that was out prior, this was a 2021 release. It's earned 1.8 billion worldwide, $800 million in domestic box office since being released in 2021. So Spider-Man certainly making a comeback. So you can see that Hollywood is starting to, kind of try to, get itself out of what has been a massive hole. Not to mention, by the way, not reflected here is the fact that you've also got films now being released on streaming platform first before they go into the theater. And you can say that is because of the pandemic, right? So there's been a number of films that, if you have HBO Max or Netflix or whatever, that you can watch that, normally would be in a big theater, that no longer are. Okay, anyway, most popular series, Marvel, which is owned by Disney, great investment. $25.6 billion. I forget off the top of my head how many films are in that series, but it's numerous. And that number will just continue to climb. So every time Disney, essentially releases another Marvel film, it just adds to a growing collection of how much money Disney is making at the box office. Obviously the Star Wars franchise, that is also Disney owned. I want to say about, gosh, what was it, 10 years ago? It could be longer. Basically Disney bought out George Lucas for, I think the price tag was 5.1 billion at the time for the rights to all of his films. And I remember, there was a number of articles out there talking about how crazily overpaid, I should say, how crazy it was that Disney overpaid, the Lucas people, Lucas himself, and I don't think that's true. I think they've made their money back in spades. And of course, such as films, it's the access to all the merchandise, and of course, being able to put it in their theme parks. And as someone who is a big Star Wars fan, I find it problematic, and that I think Disney is maybe doing too much with the series and putting out too many films, and taking the story in all sorts of different directions. And I don't know, maybe you disagree with me, but anyway, that's just my 2 cents. All right, and then number 3, back into the top 3, sometimes just kind of shuffles with Harry Potter, but it's James Bond, 7.8 billion. And of course, the big news, of course, with the Bond series is that, Daniel Craig, of course, has left the franchise. He just did his last film. So there's a lot of talk about who's going to replace him. We don't know. It's still up in the air, but certainly every time, a Bond film is released, it makes quite a bit of money at the box office. It's a long-standing series that goes all the way back to the 1960s. The role has been played by several, iconic actors. and Daniel Craig was the latest. And I will say personally, I will miss him because I think Daniel Craig is probably my favorite Bond in that seat, saying something, because Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, they've all done amazing jobs with the role. But I really do think Daniel Craig, in my view, is the ultimate Bond. All right, here's a couple of other numbers before we start talking local here. Annual box office, by the way, in 2021 was 2.9 billion. Look at pre-pandemic, 11.4 billion in 2019. That should tell you how much Hollywood has kind of staggered to, has tried to get back on its feet. In any event, so 11.4 billion was the last complete year where we did not have to worry about COVID. It'll be interesting to see if we ever get back to that 11.4 billion mark, because so much has changed within the industry, as has the world with COVID-19. Average weekly attendance in the 1940s reached 90 million. That was probably Hollywood's peak influence. And just so you know, 90 million, population-wise, we were at about 130 to 140 million in that era. So that means that more than half of every American was going to see a film on a regular basis. Now, remember, we'll talk more about this as we get into the lecture here. But remember when Hollywood kind of had sort of the monopoly on visual entertainment until television came along in 1946, and that was a tremendous blow to the film industry. So anyway, late 1940s, you have 20,000 theaters, but by 2010, 6,300 theaters, 40,000 screens. What that means is that rather than that experience of doing one theater, one screen, now you have what's called the multiplex, which is what you're used to. I don't know if you guys have ever had an opportunity to sit in a theater that's just like one screen, one theater, and that's all there is. El Capitan Theater down in Hollywood is probably a good example of that. It's an experience and it's cool. So, but yeah, we're all used to the multiplex. That's why that number is as it is. All right. In 1943, Americans spent more than 25% of recreational expenditures on films, meaning a quarter of every dollar was being spent on going to a film. And it's interesting because I'm 56 years old. My stepfather, who's no longer with us, grew up. He was born in 1931. He was an avid film goer. In fact, God bless him, because he took me to a lot of like vintage old films when I was a kid, but that was what he lived for. I mean, he was 10 years old. He was a kid during World War II, and he would talk about how often he would go to double features, and that was his escape. He grew up very poor in what now South Central LA, and his escape was to go see films, and it led to not just a lifetime full of appreciation of film, but he also, the fact that he was watching narratives all the time led him to be an avid reader, and led to a life where he read many books and watched lots of films. It's cool. So we don't do that as much now, right? We have a lot of other distractions that we can get into. But anyway, look at in 2019. This is a really interesting stat, because you look at the U.S. Labor Bureau, and you look at government statistics, and in 2019, this is the latest one I could find, Americans spend about $60 on movies, parks, and museums per year. I thought that was kind of low. This is an average, by the way. So that means that you're going to have a lot of people that can't afford to do this, and then you're going to have people that can obviously afford to do this much more. But we spend on average about $60 on movies, parks, and museums, $42 on sporting events, $45 for play or live theater. So on average, if you add all that up, we're looking at $160. Again, it probably seems a little low if you're a single person that's always going out and doing stuff, or you have a family, but I can tell you that from my aspect, I generally don't go to films anymore. I watch them, I watch them at home on Netflix or HBO Max. And so, perhaps my age group skews the average, right? Single people go to movies more often than folks who are married. More males go to films. I thought that was an interesting kind of stat. And it seems older generations, many of which have kids that cannot be vaccinated, are now the ones that are less inclined to venture out to theaters. Okay. So I would say the age group between 18 and 49, definitely on average returning to movie theaters by and large. But clearly, I think the older generation, leery of the fact that they don't want to be, maybe catch COVID, even if they've been vaccinated, are staying out of theaters. And you could say the same thing, I think, about, quite honestly, sporting events. So anyway, I just haven't gone to a film because it's not my rotation anymore, but I have gone to a couple sporting events. So just for the record. All right. Last but not least, and then we're going to get into part two here. Filming in the Santa Clarita Valley. There's no doubt that the Santa Clarita Valley and even our own campus here at COC have gone to great lengths to embrace not just the film business, but the television production industry, commercial production industry. You may even have people who, a parent, a brother, a sister, maybe you're involved in the film industry. Sometimes I get, students in class who are actually, part-time actors or actresses, whatnot. But just so you know, Santa Clarita has a lot of tax incentives and is incentivized wanting to bring Hollywood here, and actually has a number of locations here, both inside and outside. And there's, in fact, I was just working out at my gym yesterday, and across the street were a number of, those movie vans, right? Because that's, so much shooting it's done here. But basically, California provided $400 million in incentives back in 2016. There was a lot of runaway production prior to that, because it was getting too expensive to do business here in California. And so you had a number of television production companies and film companies in particular that moved away. They either moved overseas to Australia or to Europe, or they were moving to Canada. Toronto, Canada was another popular spot. Vancouver, Canada was another one. Or they moved to New Mexico. New Mexico has a very healthy film program, as does Michigan and North Carolina. So they moved, right? They just bailed. And so it cost California a tremendous amount of jobs and financial impact. And so I was here for a meeting that took place down the hall right here on the third floor of Mentry Hall. And it was done so with a number of not just local people here in Santa Clarita, but industry insiders. And there was a push ultimately by Sacramento state legislature to make sure that we brought, or I should say that they brought back, some of the film and television production industry back to California. And so Santa Clarita has actually benefited tremendously from that. In fact, the total economic impact is $30 million for location shooting in the Santa Clarita Valley. In 2021, there were 570 film permits issued, 1,505 film days. In fact, one of the things that happened during COVID in 2020 was, obviously Santa Clarita got hit particularly hard because you had, first of all, Santa Clarita relies on the film and production industry as well as tourism for like say Six Flags. And so when those two kind of were to stand still for the middle part of 2020, it really made one of the more tough economic times here in the Santa Clarita Valley. So television, by the way, accounts for half of all production in the 30-mile zone, which means 30 miles like in relationship to Hollywood, right? Basically, that makes this area certainly attractive because we're within that 30-mile zone. There's 20 sound stages and 12 ranches here. And so they're all over. And there's a huge one, obviously. Disney has one called the Golden Oak Ranch, which is out there by Placerita Canyon. These are just some of the things that have been shot or are being shot. NCIS, Westworld, one of my favorite shows on HBO, LA Fire and Rescue, Promised Land, Star Trek, Picard, Under Armour, is, you know, ads for Under Armour, music videos. There was one with Lady Gaga and, oh gosh, I forget the other one. Oh, Justin Bieber, I think it is. Still photo shoots. They film a number of things here on our campus. You know, there's always filming going on here. In fact, at one point, a couple of years ago, I know that COC basically recognized over $500,000 in extra money just from the filming that was going on here at the school. And films, by the way, include Space Jam, A New Legacy, Snake Eyes, 892, Baby Stealer. These are the ones that I think are the more recent ones. There's been, of course, a number of other films that have been, you know, produced here in the past. You know, what I would recommend doing is if you go to the City of Santa Clarita website, you'll see actually, or you can just Google City of Santa Clarita Film Office, and you can see exactly what's been actually shot here or is being produced here. So that is part one, and that is, of course, all of the, you know, cultural and financial impact of film. In part two, we're going to get into history. So I would encourage you, strongly encourage you, you know, at some point to look at part two. So next time I see you, it will be for part two. So thanks again. Until next time.